I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're safe and very sound. And welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual discussions, at least for now, of issues of critical importance to America and to the world. I'm truly pleased and honored this morning to be able to host former Secretary of State James A. Baker III for a discussion on U.S. foreign policy, politics, and the state of the world. And I must add a personal note, Mr. Secretary, before we start. What an honor and privilege it was for me to be able to work for you during 4 extraordinary years, tumultuous years, revolutionary years, but productive years. And dare I say, I will say, having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, that I'm not sure the United States has been admired, respected, and feared to the degree that it needs to be since those fateful years. And I hope at some point we'll return to that sort of situation. So let's begin. I wanted to start with a couple questions on, I guess, what I would call the backstory. So don't shoot me. I know you don't like talking about yourself. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser in The Man Who Ran Washington laid out a pretty compelling picture of the early years, but it's always intrigued me. As a young lawyer, you came to Washington for a career change in your early 40s, professing, at least in the memoir, that you really didn't have much of an interest in politics and diplomacy. And yet, within a decade or more, you ended up running 5 presidential campaigns, serving as chiefs of staff to Republican presidents, Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of State. I guess my question is, how was it possible for any human to do that? What was it about your background, your training, your sensibility that enabled you to have that kind of success?
Well, Aaron, it's good to see you, and thank you for those kind comments in your introduction. I got to say one thing. I think I was lucky to have you on my team at that time, and we got something done on Middle East peace that had never been done before. I think that it's better to be lucky than good. And I was lucky. I came along at the right time. It was in the aftermath of Watergate. Most of the prominent Republican politicos had been eliminated from public service and politics by the Watergate scandal. So there was a sort of a vacuum up there in Washington. More importantly, I had a wonderful team. And I had a wonderful team, Aaron, from the time I first started until my public service career ended in 1992. I had a wonderful team at the White House when I was President Reagan's chief of staff. I had a wonderful team at Treasury when I was Treasury Secretary. And I had a great team at the State Department. And my view has always been that the most important thing to do to succeed, particularly in the competitive environment of politics or public service in Washington, D.C., is to surround yourself with strong people. Some people don't like to do that because they think it tends to take the sheen off of them, out for themselves. But my view is you'll never succeed at those tough jobs if you don't have a really first-rate team. And I had a first-rate team in all of those jobs, whether they were political jobs or whether they were public service jobs. And I think that more than anything else is the reason I was successful. My father, of course, drummed into me, and Peter and Susan's book points this out, the mantra of the 5 Ps: prior preparation prevents poor performance. And I never winged it. I didn't wing it. In fact, in the book, Peter and Susan point out that the staff at the White House, when I was Reagan chief of staff and I was going to go on a Sunday show, they used to bemoan the fact that in preparing me, it took so long because I'd want to go through every possible question we could think of. So I think those are some of the reasons. I happen to also have the good fortune of having a rising star in the GOP as my best friend, and in George Bush, and of course he was on the rise at that time, and that helped me in those jobs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You know, I largely courtesy to you. I don't remember if you recall, but must have been 8 or 9 years ago. You helped me get an interview with George H.W. Bush, and I asked him why he chose you as Secretary of State. And he asked me if I played golf. I said, no, I hit a few tennis balls in my day, but no golf. He said, well, do you know what a gimme is? And actually, I kind of figured it out. He said to me, Jim Baker was a gimme as Secretary of State. And then he went on to say he was a tough trader. That's the words he used, tough trader, and a guy who read people really well. So, I mean, and I know about the closeness of your personal relationship with the former president, but what is it, do you think, about your relationship with Bush 41 that enabled you to succeed in negotiations and in leveraging the political power that are so critically important to making deals that last?
Well, I think George Bush understood how the national security apparatus of the United States was intended to function. And he saw to it that his national security apparatus functioned that way. And he vested me with the preeminent position in his national security structure. He made it very clear from day one that his Secretary of State, as the statute, frankly, describing the job says, would be his primary advisor in the formulation and implementation of foreign policy. So we had a for the most part, very cohesive and cooperative team that conducted the foreign policy of the United States for those 4 years. President Bush, because of the closeness of our association, the closeness of our relationship, made sure that I was never seen to be sort of on the outs of what was going on. I never will forget one time, Washington Post had a story saying, well, the real power in foreign policy is the National Security Council under the leadership of Brent Scowcroft. And so, you know, there's always a healthy tension between Secretary of State, oftentimes, not always, and the National Security Advisor. Well, first, when George read that, first thing he did was he called me and said, hey, I want you and Susan to come up to Camp David this weekend. And they had a little publicity of it, and that ended that kind of talk about who was his primary advisor in formulating and implementing foreign policy.
I mean,
there were any number of instances, Aaron, that I could cite for you where that relationship was critical to what we got accomplished. For one thing, when we went to the United Nations to get a resolution authorizing the use of force against the member state Iraq to kick them out of Kuwait, first time it ever been done since way back in Korea, there was big opposition to that within our administration. The National Security Advisor, National Security Council, Secretary of Defense, many others said, oh, you don't want to go to the UN, you get all wrapped around the axle. Well, remember, we didn't have the Congress. We didn't control either house, the House or the Senate. And we had to put some legitimacy, or an argument for legitimacy, on what we wanted to do. And my thought was, and George agreed with me, his thought too was, if we could get a resolution out of the Security Council then it would be pretty hard for the House or Senate, the congressmen or senators, to say they wouldn't support this. You mean you're not going to support the president when the president of Ethiopia supports him and so forth? Well, he stuck with me on that. And we went to the UN and we got our resolution, and it was critical to accomplishing what we accomplished. We put an arms embargo on Iraq right after the invasion, if you remember. And all of a sudden, our intelligence shows us there's an Iraqi ship sailing in the Persian Gulf to Yemen. Well, everybody insisted to the president that he take that out. Otherwise, you don't take that out, you're going to be seen to be a wimp. You're a wuss. You got to go right now. Take it out. Well, the Soviet Union's foreign minister was telling me, wait a minute, give us a couple of days. Let's see if because Iraq was a Soviet client state. And over the arguments of the National Security Council people, the defense people, Margaret Thatcher, our longtime ally, Prime Minister of the UK, President came down, sided with me. I was at the ranch in Wyoming talking to him on a tax stat out of from a boulder outside my cabin. He went with me. If he hadn't gone with me and we'd taken that ship out, we'd have lost the Soviet Union in the coalition, and we never would have gotten the resolution that we needed in order to ultimately get the Congress on board.
That's a critically important point. It takes allies and adversaries about 5 minutes to figure out whether there's daylight between the president of the United States and the secretary. And at home with Congress and other elements of the bureaucracy, it's as important. You once said that you weren't going to be the secretary's man at the White House, or you said you were going to be the White House's man at the State Department.
That's what I said.
You were not going to be the State Department's man at the White House. And that was a lesson perhaps you learned from George Shultz, but that was extremely important politically at home and abroad. I think that enabled you to succeed as you did more often than not.
Well, you're quite right that people at home and abroad are very quick to see any daylight. George Bush never let there be any daylight between him and me. Even when I would screw up, he was there for me and he would defend me. I tried not to screw up too much, but that was absolutely critical to the strength of our foreign policy, the substance of it, and to a foreign policy that was coordinated and speaking with one voice. You're familiar with the incidents in the book as well about times when I had to break a little china over at the White House by shutting down a speech that somebody wanted to give that ran counter to what our policy was. And I was in a position to pick up the phone, call my friend and say, hey, you don't want this out there. We need to speak with one voice. And he would go with me.
I mean, I don't remember historically or even during the period I was in government, a Secretary of State being able to pick up the phone and talk to a president like that. There was one moment in the negotiations over German reunification, I think, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser reported in the book that you had said to Bush 41, if I'm put in this position again, you're going to have to find yourself a new Secretary of State. I mean, that's virtually unheard of. You don't do that if you're the Secretary of State talking to the president. And that, I would argue, is critically important.
But let me say this, if you do it, you better be able to leave the job. And you don't do it unless you are able to.
Right.
But it's very important to have that seamless relationship with your president. People say, to what do you give the most credit, for whatever success you had. And I said it was my seamless relationship with my president. He was my 35-year friend. He was godfather to my daughter. I ran all of his political campaigns. Nobody was going to get between me and my president. And in terms of speaking truth to power, I had to do that all the time when he was a candidate and I was his campaign chairman. You get a lot of disagreements in things like that, and I never will forget the difficulty that we had getting Ambassador Bush then, who was running for president, to realize that the numbers were not sufficient to support his achieving the nomination against Ronald Reagan, and he should get out before he went to California and screwed up whatever chance he might have of being vice president. It was brutal all weekend long, and we finally got him to agree, and it's a good thing. And I think he would tell you that today.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question about the backstory before we move on to current foreign policy and domestic politics. And that's the issue of negotiations. I mean, I watched you for 9-10 months on the way to Madrid. It was really quite remarkable to watch you negotiate. And I think it's clear that in the last 50, 60 years, you and Secretary of State Kissinger, however diverse and different your dispositions and backgrounds, were two extraordinary negotiators as Secretaries of State. Now, a simple question. David Gergen said that you divided problems into three areas: the easy ones, the ones that were doable but hard but doable, and then the mission impossibles. If you had to identify one, other than the support you got from the president, one element of your negotiating style that was more important than any other in brokering and ultimately closing deals, what would that have been?
Well, I don't know whether I can identify one. I can mention a number that I think are important, and one is to make sure you put yourself in the shoes of the guy across the table, your interlocutor, so that you know what his red lines are and aren't. I mean, that's really important. So you know how far you can push and how far, and when you have to stop. Building trust. You mentioned George Shultz. There's going to be a service this coming week for George in San Francisco, a service of remembrance. And one thing that was really important to George, and he talked about a lot, was trust. Trust as the coin of the realm. Trust is really important in negotiating too. If you can establish a relationship with the guy across the table built on trust, if you get to the point where you know you can trust his word and he can trust yours, you have a hell of a lot better chance of finding a way to an agreement. I think it's also important never to lie when you're negotiating.
Yeah.
Lies are often, lies never stay secret very long. And the minute you lie, well, the guy on the other side of the table is totally lost confidence. So, and the same thing goes coming back your way. If somebody lies to you, you know you can't rely on them and you really can't negotiate with them. And then I think that to look at a negotiation as a series of confidence building steps, take it a step at a time. You remember my saying in the negotiations on Madrid, we got to crawl before we walk, and we got to walk before we run. And that's I think, an important principle of negotiation.
I mean, not many people know this, speaking of the trust issue, but despite all the broken crockery that you and Bush 41 had with Shamir, you basically implemented all of those principles you just identified to me in your relationship with him. And people saw that relationship as acrimonious and adversarial, and there was an element of it, but there was trust there, which surprised me.
I've said many times we disagreed on many policy issues, but we didn't leak on each other. I trusted what he told me. He trusted what I told him. We had a good personal relationship, even though we disagreed on a number of policy issues, like primarily settlements and so forth.
Right. Let's turn to some current foreign policy issues. I heard a quote the other day, whether it was true or not, I'm still trying to run it down, that FDR said about Lincoln that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. And governing is about choosing. You got to set priorities. I would say that maybe that's your 6th P, priorities. If you were advising President Biden now on the issue of the greatest or the most serious foreign policy challenge facing the Republic today, almost a year into his presidency, what would you say that challenge was abroad? And any thoughts about general thoughts about how you deal with it?
You're talking about foreign policy challenges, not overall challenges to the United States.
Yeah, we'll get to those in a bit, but the foreign policy side.
There's some huge domestic challenges.
Yes, I know.
Foreign policy challenges, I would say that how we relate to the emergence of China as a global superpower is the biggest challenge facing biggest foreign policy challenge facing our foreign policy makers today. I used to say that the best way to find a fight is to go looking for one. You can confront without triggering war. Okay, I mean, it's not a case of rolling over or going to war. There's plenty of places in between, and what we need to do with China is to confront China when her policies collide with ours, wherever that may be, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Tibet, whether it's trade, whether it's human rights. And we got to manage those differences. Those differences are going to continue to exist. And we need to find a way to manage them as China emerges as the other global superpower, which is going to happen. There are areas, however, where I think we could work with China, not have to confront them. China's going to be our competitor. They're going to be a vigorous competitor, and that gets into some things we need to do domestically, like improving our education system and a whole host of other things.
Right.
But we need to manage our differences where they exist, and be willing to find common ground in those instances where that's possible, and that is possible in some areas.
It does require, though, something that stood at the center of your whole approach to negotiations, which is understanding that the other party has legitimate needs and requirements.
Right.
And that containment and confrontation, those two C's need to be joined by a third, which is some kind of cooperation.
That's
in
right.
this political environment, though, where being tough on China seems to cross party lines, it seems harder to do that. And it seems the administration is reluctant to do that. The Chinese are not making it any easier with their hostage diplomacy and their wolf warrior diplomacy. So there probably is an element there. I'm just hoping, to use a quote from one of my colleagues at Carnegie, Evan Feigenbaum, that the best we can do with China is managed enmity. I hope we can do better than that, for all the reasons that you say.
That's almost what I'm saying. And manage our differences and cooperate where that's possible, but don't let it spiral into conflict. Confront, cooperate, avoid conflict.
Yeah.
But again, the best way to find a war is to go looking for
To
one.
go looking for
We don't need to do that. We can confront China. Same thing is true, by the way, with Russia. We've gone from a position of cooperation with a Putin government to a position of confrontation. Russia is buzzing our ships and planes. Well, guess what? That would end in a hurry if we shot down one of those planes that are buzzing our ships and planes. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, that would be a message to the Russians. Hey, this is unacceptable. It violates every norm of international behavior. You're not going to do it with us anymore. It would only happen one time.
You dealt successfully with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, very successfully. But you're not dealing with those kinds of Russians today, right? You're dealing with a different kind of Russian.
Right.
And I just wonder, you've dealt with some tough traitors yourself. What about Putin? I mean, applying honey and vinegar, incentives and disincentives. How do you go from identifying genuine areas of cooperation to the kind of managed enmity that avoids conflict and confrontation? We are the only two powers on the face of the planet that are quite capable of destroying the planet. So how do you manage Putin?
Well, I think it's important to send clear signals, to let him know what our red lines are, maybe to understand his red lines. But for many years, Aaron, we forget this. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had for 15 years a very good relationship with Russia, under the leadership, by the way, of Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. And it was only after Putin got in a little trouble, I think, domestically, that things changed. And he needed a whipping boy. The United States was a whipping boy. NATO was a whipping boy. For domestic political purposes, he needed a foreign whipping boy. So I think we can, I'm not worried about Russia. I really am not. I think we need to be strong where we're right. And we need to, again, manage whatever differences we have where there's some question about whether we're right. I mean, people say a lot of times we push the expansion of NATO too fast. Well, there may be an element of truth to that. Maybe too far, too. But expansion of NATO is something that I favored. I think it's the right policy, but there may have been a better way to do it. But what really the straw that broke the camel's back, in my view, was when we wanted to build a missile defense system in Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the Russians came to us and said, we'd like to be a part of that. But no, they came to us and they said, hey, wait a minute, this is designed to negate our strategic deterrent. And we said, no, this is against Iran. And the Russians said, well, then we'd like to be a part of it. We'll pay our share and we'd like to be part. We said, no, you can't be a part of it.
Yeah.
Well, that was a little bit of overreach on our part. And I can understand why in the aftermath of things like that, the Russians might think we were plotting against them, which we weren't.
I could see it too. I want to talk to you about Afghanistan and then move to domestic politics. Right decision, wrong implementation. What's your view?
Yeah, right decision. Getting out was the right decision. 20 plus years, that's plenty long to fight a war. And anyway, the original purpose of the war was to get Al Qaeda and get Osama bin Laden. When he went to Pakistan, the original purpose sort of diminished or disappeared. And then we got into the nation building mode, okay? It's a classic example of mission creep. The United States cannot be the policeman for the world. There are a lot of countries out there that would like to have us seen to be that and like to have us be that, but we can't. Yeah. Our polity won't support it, and they shouldn't support it. But that was a classic case of mission creep. It was also a classic case of the inadvisability, if you will, of setting concrete deadlines when you're talking about military operations. The minute you say you're going to leave a battlefield on a certain date, boy, don't think your enemies can't use that against you in a very effective way. So there were a lot of mistakes made. The way we left was terrible, really regrettable, cost us a lot, cost the United States a ton in public opinion and in reputational credibility around the world. What good is our word, you know? And giving up Bagram Air Force Base in the middle of the night without telling the Afghan commander there we're going to do it, and without briefing our allies. How in the world do we get to that point? I mean,
but let me ask you, I mean, and I agree with you, the process of withdrawal could have been improved, but yesterday you had chairman of the Joint, you had the head of CENTCOM, and the Secretary of Defense all basically say that they'd advise the president to keep a limited number of forces there. McKenzie wanted to double the 2,500.
Yeah.
Was there a way to get out? And this is where the paradox is. Was there a way to get out without retaining some sort of residual force to protect Bagram, to secure Kabul, to deal with the extrication process of thousands of Afghans at risk, and obviously American citizens? That's the part of this that I don't get. If you're going to get out, you're going to have to extricate your forces. And once the order is given to do that, the Pentagon is going to want to move very quickly because
Well, wait a minute. Extricating your forces doesn't mean you take them out before you get your people out.
Right. So you would have reversed, you would have basically tried to do the whole process and assumed that things would be stable, that the Afghan government wouldn't fall and the Afghan National Security Forces would.
Well, even if it fell, if you'd kept Bagram, I mean, we secured the Kabul airport, the civilian airport. We could have kept Bagram. There would have been a place there to get people out. Get out those poor translators who work with. I just think it was a totally botched operation. Yeah. It makes us look like we don't know what we're doing, and we didn't know what we were doing the way we got out. But it was the right thing to do.
Right.
To leave.
I agree.
To end the war.
All right. Let me turn finally to the issue of domestic politics. If I were to ask you, again, there are many challenges, but in the mind of James A. Baker III, what is the most threatening and dangerous challenge domestically confronting the United States today?
Well, there are two, and I think they're equally threatening and equally dangerous. One is our ticking fiscal debt bomb. Nobody talks about that anymore. That used to be a big item, a political item of debate between our parties. We cannot keep spending like drunken sailors. Sooner or later, the chickens will come home to roost. We have a debt to GDP today. You're talking to a former Treasury Secretary. I have a debt to GDP today of 108%. That's unsustainable. for a major power. And you know that, and we do not have the political will to deal with it. We should do something like Simpson-Bowles, which President Obama appointed a commission with Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, and they came forward with some good recommendations. Republicans would accept more revenue increases, and Democrats would accept reduced spending. That's the only way you're going to get out. There is no other way out except one, and that is to inflate your way out.
Right.
That is a terrible way to get out, and that will punish middle-class Americans and the poor more than it will anybody else. But I'm afraid that may be the direction we're going. It's because I don't see the political will to do it any other way. And now we're up there debating, having just spent $1.5 trillion or more dollars on COVID relief. We're now talking about a $3.5 trillion spending bill for human infrastructure, which is really social safety net programs, which are important, and there may be a reason to infuse them with more substance today. But my goodness, $3.5 trillion. We can't keep doing this. Sooner or later, the chickens will come home to roost. Interest rates today are very low, but they're not going to stay there forever. They're beginning to ooch up now. When they get up, we're going to be paying inordinate amounts of debt service to China and Japan and other countries that own our Treasury securities. So that's
one problem.
Threat number one. Threat number two is the political dysfunction of the country. We no longer have governments that do the people's business. We send people to Washington, and they have the luxury of just going up there and fighting. They don't have to get anything done, and we don't demand that they get the people's business done. And that's a terrible thing, and there are a lot of causes for it. We probably don't have time for me to lay them all out, which I'm happy to do if you want to hear them. But that's a very significant a challenge facing the country. We got to find a way to get out of that, and we could start by having electing people who go to Washington and understand that compromise is not a dirty word.
Right.
That's the way you govern.
That's critically important. You know, our mutual friend, Tom Friedman, wrote a piece today in the New York Times. I don't know whether you saw it, not a long piece, in which he basically says, he asks Liz Cheney, how come there are no more Liz Cheneys in the Republican Party? And by extension, he then goes on to say there should be Liz Cheneys on the Democratic side. People who are willing to stand up to bridge the progressive liberal divide in the Democratic Party and to bring around those centrists, conservatives in the Democratic Party, to a compromise on these infrastructure bills, social safety net on the second one. So I want to ask you, you are a conservative Republican. I mean, I understand that. You supported our former president, and I'm trying to figure out, just help me understand how, given, and it goes beyond the problem is not the personality of a single human now. It's also what's happened to our institutions. It's undermining the Constitution, respect for rule of law, election integrity, which is being directly challenged. All of these principles, they're the antipode, the antithesis of everything James Baker has stood for.
Absolutely.
Including compromise. So help me understand, or how to reconcile. I mean, I'm self-appointed fan, Washington, D.C. president of the James A. Baker III fan club. But help me understand how to reconcile that, the support for the former president, with what's being done to undermine our democracy. And
All right, I can answer it in a very easy, a very quick way, Aaron. We only have a binary choice in this country, okay? And in 2016, we were faced with a choice of someone who was a semi-conservative, a Republican, and a flaming Democratic liberal. I am a conservative Republican from Texas. I believe in smaller government. I believe in paying our bills. I don't believe in all this spending on the backs of our grandchildren. I believe in a strong defense. I believe in those principles that have historically been the guiding principles of the Republican Party. I do not support and never have a lot of the behavior of the former president of the United States. It's in the book. He came to see me, I'm sure, to talk to me about whether I might be, having run 5 presidential campaigns, be in a position to help. And I made it pretty clear that I wasn't. But that doesn't equate to my being ready to vote for the other side of the political spectrum, the only other option. I guess I could have not voted, but I don't think that's very smart either. I don't think I think that's just wasting. So guess what? 4 years of Trump has given us a lot, in my view. Now, I'm a conservative Texan, given us a lot of really good judicial appointments that we would not have had Hillary Clinton been our president. It has given us an elimination of a lot of regulations that many of which I think are unnecessary and which hamper our economic development. So it's those kind of things, and you know from having been in Washington yourself, so many things happen in government below the level of the chief executive, below the level of the president. And that's why I voted the way I voted. And probably given the same situation back up to 2016 would do it the same way. So I hope that explains it to you. It's a binary choice, and I took the conservative choice.
No, it's who you are. I understand that. One final question before I ask the last question. Has what events of January 6th, the undermining of the corporeal representation of our democracy, the Capitol, the insurrection, the effort to stop certification, and the has any of that changed or altered your calculation?
Yeah, absolutely. That is unacceptable. We're going to find out, I suppose, the degree and extent to which the former president played a role in that. But it's unacceptable. We cannot have that. I totally agree with President Bush 43's speech the other day, where he said another source of terrorism, or a major source of terrorism, is homegrown terrorism. We've got to be alert to that, okay? And he talks specifically, I think, about the terrorism of white supremacists and so forth. But there's also another type of terrorism, in my view. And that's what happened to our cities in many states around the country last year, where, in Portland, Oregon, the mayor of Portland, or the governor, I can't remember which, says we're going to have a summer of love, and they set the city on fire. Well, come on, we ought not to permit that, just like we ought not to permit any kind of an assault on our Capitol. All of that is unacceptable. But don't tell me that homegrown terrorism only comes from the right. It can come from the left as well, and we better get rid of both both
Right, I
aspects.
think we do. Or you and I could have a separate discussion on the asymmetry here between right-wing violent extremism and that which occurs on the left, although it's a matter of degree and proportion. But look, I want to ask you one more question. You and Secretary of State, former Secretary Henry Kissinger, are, in my judgment, the two most consequential secretaries the last half century or more in the United States. About that, I am absolutely persuaded. Despite the imperfections, whatever mistakes were made, there's no question about that. If I asked you the question, how does James A. Baker III want to be remembered?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say?
Well, I would like to be remembered as a consequential Secretary of State. I would like to be remembered as a pretty good Treasury Secretary. I would like to be remembered as a good White House Chief of Staff. I would like to be remembered as someone who ran 5 presidential campaigns for 3 different Republican presidents. I'd like to be remembered for all of those jobs. And then most of all, I'd like to be remembered that I came to Washington, did those jobs, and left unindicted.
That's a wonderful way to end. And Ms. Secretary, thank you so much for giving of your time. I, for one, and I'm sure all of our listeners wish you well. There's a lot of good hunting left, I'm sure. For
Thank you, Aaron.
For James A. Baker III. But
Thank you.
So much. Thanks so much, sir.
Good to see you.
You too. Thank you for listening to Carnegie Connects, a production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists, and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment, which takes no institutional positions on public policy issues. Subscribe to Carnegie Connects on popular platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast platform. Like what you heard today? Learn more at carnegieendowment.org/Carnegie Connects. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Catherine Buchanan and Cliff Jayapranada are our executive producers. I'm Aaron David Miller, and until next time, think positive and test negative.